The Pacific skies in 1944 were a deadly chessboard. Every flight was a gamble, every dogfight a battle of wits and reflexes. On one side, the Imperial Japanese Navy's skilled pilots, confident and relentless, flying the nimble Mitsubishi A6M0, a plane that had dominated the skies since the war began. On the other side, an aircraft that many in the Japanese command dismissed as a lumbering American relic, the P-47 Thunderbolt. When the first reports of the Thunderbolt reached Japanese squadrons, the reaction was predictable: laughter. A fat, slow American fighter, we will tear it apart like we do every other Allied plane. The Zeros had danced through dogfights with ease. They had out-maneuvered bombers and older fighters alike. They had made a name for themselves as the dominant force in the air over the Pacific. And now, the new American fighter was supposed to be another easy target, but the Japanese pilots didn't know the P-47's secret. Beneath its bulky frame and seemingly cumbersome design lay a machine built for survival, power, and sheer destruction. The Thunderbolt was not just a plane. It was a fortress in the sky. Its radial engine roared like a beast unleashed, propelling it to speeds that could surprise even the most experienced Zero pilot. Its armor plating could absorb hits that would cripple a lighter fighter, and its 50 caliber machine guns could shred an enemy aircraft before it could even react. As the first Thunderbolts arrived in forward airfields, American pilots were quietly confident but tense. They knew the Zeros were fast, agile, and cunning. But the P-47 was a different kind of predator. Its approach was simple yet deadly: engage, endure, and overpower. The Americans didn't laugh at the enemy. They studied every move, every habit, every tactical weakness. Intelligence had shown them that overconfidence was the Achilles heel of even the best pilots. The first encounters were almost anticlimactic, at least on the surface. Zeros approached with their usual daring, expecting the lumbering Thunderbolts to fall behind, to crumble under coordinated attacks. But instead of retreating, the P-47s held formation. They didn't dodge, they countered. They didn't panic, they pressed forward. Each Thunderbolt that roared past a Japanese plane sent a message: underestimation could be fatal. On the ground, Japanese commanders were initially dismissive. Reports of minor losses trickled in, and they shrugged them off as beginner mistakes. Our pilots are skilled. These Americans cannot match our experience. But in the cockpit, the reality was far harsher. Every sortie revealed a new layer of the P-47's capabilities. It could dive faster than the Zeros, outgun them, and take hits that would send lighter planes spiraling into the ocean. What the Japanese didn't realize was that this was just the beginning. In this first chapter of confrontation, the stage was set for a shocking reversal. The skies that had once been a playground for the Japanese aces were about to turn into a crucible of fire and steel. One miscalculation, one moment of overconfidence, would be enough to tip the scales. And for the pilots in the P-47s, every dive, every turn, every burst of gunfire was a step toward a day that would be remembered as a turning point in aerial combat history. The day began quietly, almost deceptively. The sun rose over the Pacific Islands, painting the water in shades of gold and blue. Japanese pilots lined up on the tarmac, engines humming, ready to assert their dominance. Across the airfield, P-47 pilots went through their pre-flight checks, calm but focused, each aware of the stakes. It was not just a fight of machines. It was a fight of wits, courage, and sheer nerve. And then, as the first planes took off, the clash began. A single encounter would spiral into chaos. Miscalculations would multiply. The Zeros, confident in their speed and agility, would discover a harsh truth. Underestimating the P-47 was a deadly mistake. By the end of the day, dozens of Japanese pilots would be lost. The Thunderbolt, once mocked, would carve a new legend in the skies over the Pacific. The stage was set. The air was tense with anticipation. And as engines roared, propellers slicing through the humid morning air, a single truth became clear. The Pacific skies had a new master, and it was a machine the Japanese had never expected to fear. When the P-47 Thunderbolt first rolled off the assembly lines, many considered it an oddity. a massive, heavy fighter that seemed ill, suited for the nimble, lightning, fast dogfights the Pacific was famous for. With its stubby wings, broad fuselage, and massive radial engine, it looked more like a flying tank than a fighter. Yet, beneath that intimidating exterior lay a machine designed to dominate the skies in ways few could imagine. The first Thunderbolts deployed to the Pacific theater were carefully watched by both sides. American engineers and pilots knew the P-47's strengths, but Japanese intelligence was skeptical. Reports described it as slow, unwieldy, and easily outmaneuvered. The Zero, in contrast, was a sleek predator built for agility, capable of twisting and turning with near impossible precision. Experienced Japanese aces were confident that their dogfighting skills would easily overpower the clumsy American newcomer. But the P-47 had a secret weapon, raw power. Its engine was a behemoth, a Pratt & Whitney R2008, 100 double Wasp radial engine capable of generating 2.0 horsepower. It could climb, dive, and accelerate with a suddenness that caught even seasoned pilots off guard. In combat, the Thunderbolt's heavy frame was not a liability, it was armor. A Zero could fire on it and bounce harmlessly off the thick fuselage. A direct hit might slow the P-47, but it would almost never bring it down. In contrast, the P-47's guns were brutal. 8 50-caliber machine guns fired in unison, tearing through Japanese planes with devastating precision. One short burst and a nimble Zero could be shredded into fragments of metal and fire. Beyond raw firepower, the Thunderbolt excelled at high-speed dives. Japanese pilots had long relied on vertical maneuvers and looping dogfights to outmatch slower planes. They thought speed in a dive was their advantage. But the P-47's engineers had designed a fighter that could dive faster than almost any Japanese plane, picking up velocity with frightening efficiency while maintaining control. A P-47 could swoop down from altitude, unleash a devastating burst of fire, and climb back to safety before the enemy even had time to react. This combination of armor, firepower, and speed created a new form of air dominance. Japanese pilots who had spent years mastering aerial combat found themselves facing a machine that defied conventional tactics. The Thunderbolt was not meant to dance like a Zero. It was meant to strike, endure, and devastate. It was a different philosophy of air combat, one built not on finesse but on overwhelming power. When the P-47s first took off from American airfields in the Pacific, their appearance sent ripples of unease through the ranks of both pilots and commanders. Unlike the sleek, fragile fighters of earlier encounters, these planes were visible symbols of an American approach to war, brute force applied with precision. Pilots who had trained for months to outmaneuver enemies now had to reconsider their assumptions. The P-47 demanded respect before it demanded action. Yet, for all its power, the P-47 required skilled pilots to unleash its potential. Unlike the nimble Zeros, which could be handled with instinct and daring alone, the Thunderbolt demanded discipline, strategy, and understanding of its strengths. American pilots were trained to exploit the P-47's armor and firepower, to engage in tactics that maximized its advantages while minimizing risk. And as the first encounters began, these lessons would prove deadly for those who underestimated them. The psychological impact of the P-47's arrival cannot be overstated. Japanese pilots, accustomed to dominating the skies, initially laughed at the lumbering fighters. They mocked the thick fuselage, the heavy wings, the sheer size. But laughter faded quickly. Each encounter with a P-47 forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth. This was no ordinary aircraft. It could take punishment, deliver lethal force, and retreat safely to strike again. And in war, the first to adapt often survived, while the slowest to learn paid the ultimate price. The arrival of the Thunderbolt marked a turning point. It was not just another plane in the sky. It was a symbol of shifting power, a harbinger of tactics that would leave Japanese pilots scrambling. By the time the first full-scale engagements began, the Zeros would realize that their old strategies were outdated. Speed alone would not save them. Agility alone would not win. To face the P-47 was to confront a fighter designed to change the rules of aerial combat forever. As the sun rose over the Pacific, the first P-47s took to the sky. Their engines roared like thunder, their silhouettes casting long shadows over islands and ocean alike. For Japanese pilots watching from below, the moment was a revelation. The Thunderbolt had arrived, and the day the skies were truly tested was about to begin. The Imperial Japanese pilots had been trained for excellence. From the earliest days of the Pacific War, they had learned to value agility, precision, and instinct over brute force. Their aircraft, particularly the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, were extensions of their own skill, light, fast, and maneuverable. With years of combat experience behind them, many Japanese pilots carried a sense of invincibility into every sortie. They had dominated the skies over Pearl Harbor, over Southeast Asia, over the Solomon Islands. Victory was their expectation, not their hope. When intelligence reports first described the P-47 Thunderbolt, a mix of skepticism and derision swept through the Japanese ranks. A fat, slow American plane. Its engine is large, but that makes it heavy. It cannot outmaneuver a Zero. It cannot withstand our fire. For the Japanese, experience was everything, and experience suggested that this new plane would be just another target. To them, underestimation was logical. The Thunderbolt simply did not fit the image of a lethal combat aircraft. But underestimation in war is often a fatal mistake. While Japanese pilots focused on what they thought were weaknesses, the plane's weight, its bulk, its size, they overlooked the very qualities that made the P-47 deadly. Its armor was unlike anything they had faced. Its guns could obliterate even the most agile aircraft in seconds, and crucially, it could endure punishment that would destroy a lighter fighter. In training exercises, they had never faced a plane that could absorb their attacks and still fight back with devastating effect. The mindset of the Japanese pilots contributed to their peril. Years of dominance in aerial combat had reinforced confidence, and confidence had hardened into overconfidence. Many pilots relied on instinct, on experience, on the assumption that a faster, more agile aircraft could always out-maneuver a slower opponent. They assumed the P-47 size would make it predictable, easy to trap, easy to shoot down. They did not anticipate tactics designed around endurance and firepower rather than agility alone. Early encounters confirmed their misconceptions, at least initially. Japanese pilots swooped in on the Thunderbolts, testing maneuvers and firing bursts from their machine guns. Some succeeded in avoiding direct hits, and a few even managed to damage the P-47s. These small victories reinforced their belief that the Thunderbolt was just another enemy plane, one that could be defeated with skill and daring. But these early skirmishes masked the full extent of the Thunderbolt's capabilities. They were only the first warnings in a day that would spiral into disaster. The P-47's armor allowed it to shrug off hits that would have been fatal to a Zero. Japanese pilots found that bullets that normally shredded enemy planes had little effect. Even when the Thunderbolt was smoking or hit directly, its pilot could maintain control, counterattack, and retreat to regroup. For the Japanese, this resilience was baffling. They were encountering a fighter that did not conform to the rules of their combat experience. Every maneuver that had worked against earlier enemies now had a diminished effect. Another critical factor was speed in dives. Japanese pilots had long used vertical maneuvers to gain the upper hand. They assumed the P-47 would falter in this arena, but its engineering defied expectations. With its massive engine and robust structure, it could dive faster than a Zero, accelerating past the enemy while maintaining stability and control. Attacking pilots found themselves outpaced, unable to close the distance before the Thunderbolt fired its guns or changed position. This was a new kind of aerial threat, one that required more than instinct to counter. The culture of confidence among Japanese pilots also played a role. They had celebrated victories that seemed impossible, fought in challenging conditions, and returned to base with tales of audacious maneuvers. This legacy of success created a mental blind spot, the assumption that past experience guaranteed future performance. When facing the P-47, this assumption proved dangerous. It blinded them to the nuances of a plane that was not just different, but revolutionary in combat. By the time the day of the major engagement arrived, the stage was set for a dramatic reversal. Japanese pilots lined up for battle expecting an easy victory, a chance to demonstrate skill and superiority. They were unaware that they were about to confront a force that did not fit their expectations. The Thunderbolt's arrival had introduced a new variable, one that would rewrite the rules of aerial combat in the Pacific. Overconfidence, misjudgment, and the assumption that the enemy would be predictable all converged in that morning. Every Japanese pilot carried the belief that they could control the skies. Every Thunderbolt pilot carried the quiet knowledge that their aircraft was built for survival and dominance. The collision of these beliefs in the air above the Pacific would soon produce consequences neither side could ignore. As the engines revved and planes ascended into the sky, the illusion of Japanese invincibility began to crumble. The Thunderbolt was no longer a distant rumor or an object of ridicule. It was real, it was powerful, and it was about to teach a lesson that would echo across the Pacific for years to come. The first dogfights began just after dawn, when the sun was low, casting long shadows over the Pacific Islands. Japanese pilots, confident in their Zeros, swooped down from altitude, expecting to catch the Thunderbolts off guard. They had faced slower, heavier Allied aircraft before and emerged victorious. This day, they assumed, would be no different. They were wrong. The P-47 pilots, calm and disciplined, maintained tight formations. They knew that the key to surviving and winning was to leverage their plane's strengths, speed, armor, and firepower. As the first Japanese fighters approached, the Thunderbolts didn't panic. They didn't scatter. Instead, they held their line, engines screaming, guns poised. From the start, it was clear this was not going to be a conventional fight. The initial encounters were startling. Japanese pilots executed the maneuvers they had relied on for years: loops, barrel rolls, diving attacks. But each tactic was met with a counter they had not anticipated. The P-47 could dive faster, climb higher, and fire with devastating accuracy. Bullets that should have torn through the fuselage bounced off its thick armor. Zeros, accustomed to dominating lighter, fragile aircraft, found themselves struggling to inflict damage while exposing themselves to lethal return fire. Chaos erupted in the skies. Dogfights twisted and turned over islands, with planes climbing, diving, and banking in a deadly ballet. Explosions punctuated the air as rounds found their marks. Japanese pilots, once supremely confident, began to realize the mistake they had made. Their nimble fighters were no longer an advantage, they were vulnerable. Every aggressive maneuver now carried the risk of destruction. The P-47s used their dive speed to devastating effect. They could engage an enemy from above, fire, and then ascend out of range before the Japanese could retaliate. This tactic became a nightmare for the Zeros, which lacked the power and durability to follow effectively. Pilots who had once expected an easy kill found themselves being hunted instead. The Thunderbolt had turned the tables, transforming what should have been a straightforward attack into a deadly trap. The psychological impact was immediate. Japanese pilots who had laughed at reports of the Thunderbolt now felt tension, fear, and disbelief. Their assumptions about speed, maneuverability, and superiority were collapsing mid-flight. Panic crept in and hesitation became deadly. A single misstep, a poorly timed turn, an exposed flank, was enough for a P-47 to line up a shot and take a life from hundreds of feet above the ocean. In these early clashes, the P-47's firepower proved catastrophic. Its 50 caliber machine guns tore through wings, fuselages, and tails with frightening efficiency. Pilots who had relied on agility found themselves suddenly powerless. The sky was filled with smoke, fire, and debris. The once dominant Zeros were now falling in droves, each loss compounding the chaos. For every Japanese ace who tried to turn the tide, another Thunderbolt pilot seemed ready to anticipate and counter. Tactics evolved rapidly in real time. The P-47s exploited their durability to engage aggressively, knowing that even if they were hit, their planes could withstand punishment. Japanese pilots attempted traditional dogfighting strategies, but each maneuver was met with resistance and lethal fire. By mid-morning, it became evident that the day would not be a victory lap for the Japanese, but a harsh lesson in underestimation. The first major engagements set the tone for the rest of the day. The skies, once dominated by Japanese pilots, were now contested. Thunderbolts streaked across the horizon, unyielding and relentless. Every encounter reinforced the growing realization: the P-47 was not a plane to be underestimated. It demanded new strategies, new respect, and a fundamental shift in the way Japanese pilots approached aerial combat. As the sun climbed higher, the air became thick with smoke and the sound of engines and gunfire. Pilots on both sides were pushed to the limb, it testing their skills, their reflexes, and their courage. By the end of the first wave of clashes, the Japanese had lost their sense of superiority. Their underestimation of the Thunderbolt had cost them dearly, and the day was only beginning. In those first confrontations, the P-47 had revealed its full potential, a machine capable of turning the tide of battle, a fighter that could dominate not by finesse alone, but by a combination of speed, firepower, and durability that Japanese pilots had never faced. And for the pilots in the Zeros, the day would soon become a nightmare they would not forget. By mid-morning, the initial clashes had already sent shockwaves through the Japanese squadrons. What had started as a routine patrol quickly escalated into a full-blown aerial nightmare. Japanese pilots, trained for dominance, now found themselves on the defensive, scrambling to react to an enemy they had misjudged. Every sortie brought new losses. Every maneuver carried the potential for disaster. The P-47s, disciplined and relentless, pressed their advantage. They flew in tight formations, supporting one another, anticipating the enemy's moves. Their pilots had been trained to exploit the aircraft's strengths: dive speed, firepower, and survivability. The Thunderbolts could absorb hits that would have downed a Zero instantly and retaliate with devastating bursts from their 8.50 caliber guns. For every Japanese pilot who attacked, a counterattack followed almost immediately, often leaving the aggressor in flames before they could react. The numbers began to tell a grim story. Dozens of Japanese aircraft were lost within hours. Smoke trailed from downed Zeros, fiery debris spiraled into the Pacific, and pilots struggled to regain control in a sky that had suddenly turned hostile. The psychological impact was devastating. The sense of invincibility that had carried Japanese pilots through years of combat was rapidly eroding. Confidence gave way to fear, hesitation, and mistakes, each compounding the losses. The P-47's tactical superiority became even more apparent during these escalations. Pilots used high-speed dives from above to strike without warning. They engaged in boom and zoom tactics, diving at tremendous speed to unleash a deadly burst of gunfire, then climbing back to altitude before the enemy could respond. Zeros, built for agility rather than raw power, could not match this combination of speed and firepower. Attempts to turn and engage often left Japanese planes exposed, easy targets for the Thunderbolts waiting above. Amid the chaos, coordination played a crucial role. P-47 squadrons maintained disciplined formations, covering one another's blind spots and executing coordinated attacks that minimized vulnerability. The Japanese, on the other hand, had been trained to rely on individual skill and instinct. Their traditional dogfighting techniques, which had served them well against slower, lighter aircraft, were inadequate against a disciplined, armored opponent. The result was catastrophic: disorganized attacks, overextended maneuvers, and devastating losses. As the day progressed, the skies became a theater of destruction. Smoke, fire, and twisted metal filled the air. Some Japanese pilots, attempting daring maneuvers to turn the tide, were caught in midair by the overwhelming firepower of the Thunderbolts. Others, disoriented by the relentless pace of combat, collided with one another or were forced into evasive actions that left them vulnerable. The day's toll was mounting at an alarming rate. Ground commanders watched in disbelief as reports came in. The losses were staggering, more than anyone had anticipated. What had been expected to be a routine engagement had turned into a rout. The P-47s, initially underestimated, had demonstrated not only technical superiority, but also the psychological advantage of surprise and resilience. Each downed zero reinforced a growing narrative. Underestimation had deadly consequences. The P-47 pilots, meanwhile, remained focused, aware of the stakes and the skill of the enemy. They knew that even with technological advantage, complacency could be fatal. Their training emphasized discipline, situational awareness, and teamwork. Every maneuver, every burst of gunfire was calculated. They exploited their advantages without overextending themselves, turning each encounter into a tactical lesson in dominance. By the afternoon, the scale of Japanese losses became undeniable. Entire squadrons had been decimated, the surviving pilots forced into defensive retreats or desperate evasive maneuvers. The day had turned into a massacre not because the Japanese were unskilled, but because they had underestimated the P-47. What had been anticipated as an easy victory had become a crushing defeat. This escalation of losses marked a turning point in aerial combat over the Pacific. The P-47 had proven that speed and agility alone were not enough to dominate the skies. Armor, firepower, and disciplined tactics could decisively shift the balance. The day's engagements would leave a lasting impression on both sides, a lesson in humility for the Japanese pilots and a demonstration of American air power at its most effective. By the time the sun began its descent, the skies were quiet, but the echoes of destruction lingered. Dozens of Japanese planes had been lost, countless pilots shaken by the realization that their assumptions had been fatally flawed. The P-47 Thunderbolt, once mocked, had cemented its reputation as a formidable force. And in the wake of this bloody day, the balance of air power in the Pacific had begun to shift irrevocably. By the time mid-afternoon arrived, the true capabilities of the P-47 Thunderbolt had become terrifyingly clear. What the Japanese had dismissed as a lumbering, slow aircraft was now dominating the skies with unmatched efficiency. The combination of speed, firepower, and survivability allowed the Thunderbolts to engage in tactics that left their opponents scrambling and exposed. Every dogfight became a case study in the strengths of the American engineering marvel. The first and most obvious advantage was sheer durability. The P-47's fuselage and wings were heavily armored, designed to withstand direct hits from smaller caliber machine guns. Where Zeros and other lighter aircraft might disintegrate under a few bursts, the Thunderbolt could continue flying despite significant damage. Pilots reported that their planes could sustain hits to the wings, fuselage, and even the cockpit, yet still respond with lethal fire. This resilience was revolutionary in the Pacific theater, where many engagements relied on one or two hits to decide the outcome. Equally impressive was the P-47's speed, particularly in dives. Its powerful Pratt & Whitney R-2008 100 engine allowed the plane to accelerate faster than most Japanese fighters when descending from altitude. This meant pilots could execute boom and zoom tactics with devastating effect, dive from above, unleash a concentrated burst of fire on unsuspecting enemy planes, and climb back out of reach before retaliation was possible. The maneuverability of the P-47 in high-speed dives caught Japanese pilots off guard, as their aircraft could not keep up without risking structural damage or loss of control. Firepower was another critical factor. The P-47 was equipped with 8 50 caliber machine guns, each capable of sending concentrated bursts of lead through enemy planes in seconds. In the chaos of battle, the Thunderbolt's guns became instruments of destruction. Experienced pilots could eliminate multiple opponents in a single pass, and even brief engagements often left Zeros shredded beyond repair. Where agility had once been a deciding factor, raw firepower now dominated the battlefield. Tactical flexibility was equally important. The P-47 could operate effectively at high altitudes, making it ideal for intercepting enemy bombers or scouting formations. It could also descend into lower altitudes to provide ground support for advancing Allied troops, strafing enemy positions with precision and devastating effect. This dual capability made it an incredibly versatile fighter, something the Japanese had not anticipated. The Zeros, optimized for dogfights at medium altitudes, struggled to adapt to the Thunderbolt's flexibility. American pilots themselves played a crucial role in maximizing these advantages. Training emphasized discipline, situational awareness, and teamwork. Each Thunderbolt formation operated as a cohesive unit, covering blind spots, coordinating attacks, and retreating strategically when necessary. The combination of skilled pilots and a robust aircraft proved lethal. Where Japanese pilots had previously relied on instinct and individual skill, the Americans leveraged technology and strategy to control engagements. Several accounts from the day illustrate the P-47's supremacy. One pilot reported engaging a formation of 8 Zeros at high altitude. After a controlled dive, he fired a short burst that destroyed 2 planes instantly. The remaining enemy fighters attempted to counter, but his aircraft's speed allowed him to climb back to altitude, positioning himself for a second attack. Within minutes, 3 more Zeros were downed, and the formation scattered in disarray. Situations like this were repeated throughout the day, as pilots discovered that the Thunderbolt could engage aggressively without excessive risk. Even the psychological impact of the P-47's advantages contributed to its effectiveness. Japanese pilots, already struggling to adapt, quickly realized that every aggressive maneuver could be punished. Hesitation, indecision, and miscalculations became deadly, amplified by the knowledge that the Thunderbolt could endure damage and strike again. Fear compounded losses as the relentless pace of engagements left little room for error. The P-47 also excelled in teamwork tactics. Pilots covered each other's blind spots, executed pincer movements, and coordinated multi-plane attacks that overwhelmed enemy formations. This approach turned individual superiority into collective dominance. Even experienced Japanese aces found themselves isolated, their traditional tactics inadequate against disciplined, formation-based assaults. The Thunderbolt's coordinated strikes further amplified the losses suffered by the Japanese squadrons. By late afternoon, the evidence was undeniable. The P-47 Thunderbolt had proven that its combination of durability, speed, firepower, and tactical versatility could dominate even the most skilled opponents. The day's engagements were no longer about numbers alone. They were about exploiting advantages that the enemy could not match. The Japanese pilots, who had laughed at reports of the fat American plane, were now fully aware of the threat they had underestimated. Every maneuver, every dive, every burst of fire reinforced the Thunderbolt's reputation. Its advantages were not abstract. They were deadly realities that shaped the battlefield. For the Americans, the P-47 validated the engineering philosophy behind its design, a fighter built for endurance, aggression, and versatility. For the Japanese, it represented a new challenge, one that would force a reassessment of tactics, training, and expectations. By the close of the afternoon, the P-47 had proven itself not just as a machine of war, but as a symbol of strategic evolution. It was a fighter that rewarded discipline, leveraged technology, and punished overconfidence. And as the Pacific skies cleared with smoke and debris lingering over the horizon, one truth was indisputable. The P-47 Thunderbolt had arrived, and it would change the balance of power in the air forever. By evening, the aftermath of the day's engagements was clear. The Japanese had suffered a devastating blow in the skies over the Pacific, and the implications went far beyond individual losses. The Thunderbolt's dominance had not only shattered confidence among pilots, but also forced a re-evaluation of Japanese strategy. For the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army Air Service, this was more than a tactical defeat. It was a strategic alarm bell. The first and most immediate impact was morale. Japanese pilots, once supremely confident in their aerial superiority, now faced the sobering reality that the P-47 was not an enemy that could be outmaneuvered with instinct alone. The losses were severe, and for many, the day marked a personal and psychological turning point. Veteran pilots who had survived countless battles were shaken. Their once legendary confidence gave way to doubt, and hesitation crept into decisions that had previously been made with instinctive precision. Commanders on the ground recognized the broader consequences. Air superiority in the Pacific had always been a cornerstone of Japanese defensive strategy. Controlling the skies meant protecting naval operations, supply lines, and island fortifications. The P-47's sudden effectiveness meant that this superiority could no longer be taken for granted. Future operations would have to account for an aircraft that could outgun, outdive, and outlast the Zeros in ways previously unimagined. This forced a strategic recalibration, one that would influence tactics, training, and deployment for months to come. Intelligence reports from the day emphasized the threat posed by the Thunderbolt. Japanese strategists noted its high-altitude performance, heavy armament, and durability, and they realized that conventional dogfighting tactics were inadequate. Orders were issued for revised engagement strategies, emphasizing caution, group coordination, and attempts to exploit perceived weaknesses in the P-47's bulk. However, these changes could not be implemented overnight. The losses had already created gaps in pilot experience, squadron cohesion, and battlefield readiness. The strategic cost of underestimation was immediate and tangible. The impact extended beyond pilots and squadrons. Naval operations, previously confident in Japanese air cover, faced a new level of risk. Reconnaissance flights, bombing raids, and even routine patrols had to consider the presence of P-47s capable of delivering precise, lethal attacks. Each encounter became a potential disaster, limiting operational flexibility and slowing Japanese initiatives. The Thunderbolt's introduction into the theater effectively altered the calculus of risk across the Pacific. Allied command, observing the effectiveness of the P-47, also took note. Its success validated American training methods, technological investment, and tactical planning. The integration of the Thunderbolt into offensive operations allowed the Allies to push further with confidence, knowing that air cover could now be relied upon to suppress Japanese resistance. This synergy between technology and strategy demonstrated the compounding effect of superior design and disciplined execution. On a larger scale, the day's events influenced the broader air war strategy. Japanese forces, now aware that underestimating the P-47 could be catastrophic, faced a dilemma. They needed to conserve experienced pilots, revise tactics, and develop countermeasures, while simultaneously maintaining operational pressure across the Pacific. This created a tension between immediate necessity and long-term survival. Every sortie became a gamble, every engagement a test of whether the Japanese could adapt fast enough to a new dominant aircraft. The psychological ripple effect was significant as well. Stories of the Thunderbolt's effectiveness spread among Japanese ranks and into strategic planning circles. Pilots spoke in hushed tones of the machine that could absorb punishment and strike back without mercy. Commanders realized that the traditional hierarchy of fear and respect had shifted. Aircraft that were once considered inferior were now feared, and the Japanese had to confront the reality that technological and tactical evolution could not be ignored. Beyond immediate tactics, the strategic implications influenced training and recruitment. Future pilots needed to be prepared to face heavily armored fighters capable of surviving hits that would have been fatal to previous adversaries. Flight schools adjusted their curricula, emphasizing teamwork, situational awareness, and avoidance of the Thunderbolt's deadly strengths. In this way, the lessons of a single day of combat reshaped the trajectory of Japanese air operations for the remainder of the war. By nightfall, the Pacific skies had quieted, but the impact of the day's engagements reverberated across the theater. Japanese strategy, morale, and future planning had all been affected. The P-47 Thunderbolt had proven that technological superiority, when combined with disciplined tactics, could decisively shift the balance of power. What began as a single underestimation had blossomed into a strategic turning point, one that would influence the war's aerial battles long after the smoke cleared. The lesson was stark and undeniable. In war, underestimation can be deadly, and adaptation is not optional. For the Japanese, the day had been a harsh introduction to the Thunderbolt, a fighter that was more than an aircraft, more than a weapon. It was a symbol of the changing tide in the Pacific, a reminder that mastery of the skies could no longer be taken for granted. Amid the chaos of the day's battles, it is easy to focus on planes, tactics, and statistics. But the true story lies with the men in the cockpit. Pilots on both sides faced the relentless terror of combat, the weight of responsibility, and the ever-present threat of death. For Japanese and American airmen alike, the P-47's dominance transformed not just the skies, but their personal experience of war. Take Lieutenant Hiroshi Tanaka, a seasoned Japanese pilot who had flown dozens of successful sorties over the Pacific. Tanaka had faced countless Allied aircraft and survived where many had fallen. On that fateful morning, he approached the Thunderbolts with his usual confidence. Just another American plane, he thought, banking sharply to position his Zero for an attack. Within seconds, he realized his miscalculation. A single dive from a P-47 sent bullets tearing through his wing, forcing him into a frantic evasive maneuver. Smoke filled his cockpit, and for the first time, fear gripped him. By the time he returned to base, battered and shaken, he understood a hard truth. Experience alone was no match for underestimation. Across the sky, American pilots were equally tested, though in a different way. Captain James Reynolds, flying his first major sortie in a P-47, had trained extensively for such encounters, but nothing prepared him for the intensity of real combat. As he approached a formation of Zeros, he felt the adrenaline surge, hands gripping the controls tightly. Each burst of gunfire was calculated, each maneuver precise. He watched as enemy planes were shredded before his eyes, yet he could not ignore the personal toll. The knowledge that every kill carried a human life, every mistake could be fatal. Reynolds later recalled the day as both triumphant and harrowing. The Thunderbolt had given him power, but the cost of wielding it was ever present. Some stories were even more tragic. Squadron leaders who tried to rally their pilots found themselves facing the unrelenting reality of aerial warfare. One Japanese flight, attempting to regroup after initial losses, was ambushed by P-47s, executing a coordinated attack from above. Pilots were forced into desperate maneuvers, and within minutes, several planes were engulfed in flames. Survivors spoke of a sky filled with smoke, screaming engines, and the impossible task of evading the Thunderbolt's precise fire. These personal accounts brought to life the chaos and terror of the engagements that numbers alone cannot convey. Heroism, too, emerged amid the carnage. American pilots, often outnumbered, relied on teamwork and quick thinking to protect one another. When a wingman was hit, others maneuvered to cover and defend him, exploiting the P-47 strengths to ensure survival. These acts of bravery often went unnoticed, but they were instrumental in maintaining cohesion and achieving victory. The Thunderbolt, while a powerful machine, was only as effective as the men who guided it through the deadly skies. On the Japanese side, courage persisted despite overwhelming odds. Pilots who had initially underestimated the P-47 adapted on the fly, learning to anticipate its tactics and employ evasive maneuvers. Some survived by sheer skill and instinct, escaping seemingly impossible situations. Others, tragically, were not so fortunate. The stories of those who fell became a somber reminder of the human cost of underestimation, the razor, thin margin between life and death in the air. Beyond the immediate physical danger, the psychological toll was immense. Pilots on both sides faced the fear of failure, the weight of responsibility for their comrades, and the mental strain of prolonged combat. The P-47's firepower and durability amplified this pressure. Japanese pilots realized that one miscalculation could be fatal, while American pilots understood that victory came with the constant awareness of mortality. These human experiences gave depth to the day's battles, transforming statistics into stories of courage, fear, and resilience. Personal accounts also revealed moments of ingenuity and quick thinking. Pilots discovered creative ways to exploit their aircraft's capabilities under pressure. One P-47 pilot recounted diving through a narrow gap between enemy planes, using the Thunderbolt's speed to slip past gunfire and escape what seemed like certain death. On the Japanese side, some pilots attempted high-speed climbs, sudden rolls, and deceptive maneuvers in an effort to regain control of the engagement. These split-second decisions underscored the human element that defined the outcomes of each encounter. By the end of the day, the sky was littered with the remnants of machines, and the survivors were forever changed. The P-47 had not only proved its technical superiority, but had also tested the limits of human endurance, skill, and courage. Stories of heroism, loss, and survival circulated among pilots and crews, forming a tapestry of human experience that elevated the narrative of the battle beyond mere strategy. Ultimately, the day became a testament to the resilience, fear, and determination of men facing an extraordinary adversary. The P-47 Thunderbolt had changed the calculus of aerial combat, but it was the human pilot, on both sides, whose courage, skill, and sacrifice defined the battle. Theirs were the stories that history would remember, the faces behind the statistics, and the emotions behind the machine's legend. As the sun set over the Pacific, the smoke of battle still hung in the sky. The day had been a crucible, a testing ground where skill, courage, and technology collided with deadly consequences. Japanese pilots, once confident in their invincibility, had faced the brutal reality of underestimating the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt, once dismissed as a slow, cumbersome fighter, had proven itself a formidable force capable of changing the course of aerial combat in the Pacific. The lessons of that day were profound. For the Japanese, underestimation had exacted a heavy price. Dozens of pilots and aircraft were lost, morale was shaken, and long-held assumptions about air superiority were shattered. The dominance of the Zero, previously considered unassailable, had been challenged and exposed as vulnerable when faced with an aircraft that combined firepower, durability, and tactical versatility. The implications rippled through strategic planning, training, and combat doctrine, forcing a reassessment of what it meant to fight effectively in the skies. For the Americans, the P-47's performance validated years of engineering, planning, and disciplined training. It demonstrated that a fighter designed for endurance and aggression could dominate even the most skilled opponents when operated with precision and strategy. The Thunderbolt was more than a machine. It was a symbol of technological innovation, teamwork, and the ability to leverage advantages decisively. Every dive, every burst of gunfire, every coordinated maneuver underscored the principle that preparedness and design could tip the scales of battle in ways that raw instinct alone could not. The human dimension of the battle remained equally significant. Pilots on both sides faced fear, stress, and the ever-present possibility of death. The Japanese, confronted with an unexpected challenge, had to adapt quickly or perish. The Americans, wielding the Thunderbolt, had to combine courage with discipline, using the aircraft's capabilities to maximum effect without overextending themselves. Individual stories of heroism, split-second decisions, and survival under fire highlighted the human stakes behind the statistics, reminding us that every aircraft in the sky represented a life, a choice, and a gamble with mortality. The battle also illustrated a fundamental truth of warfare: underestimation can be deadly. Confidence in previous victories, reliance on familiar tactics, and assumptions about enemy weakness all contributed to disaster. The Japanese pilots, skilled though they were, paid the price for believing the P-47 could be easily defeated. Meanwhile, the Americans capitalized on every advantage, proving that preparation, innovation, and respect for the enemy could turn the tide decisively. Strategically, the day marked a shift in air power across the Pacific. The Thunderbolt's performance would influence subsequent operations, compelling the Japanese to revise their tactics, adjust training programs, and reconsider the deployment of forces. For the Allies, it offered a reliable tool to project power, maintain air superiority, and protect ground and naval forces. In this sense, the day was not merely an engagement but a turning point, a demonstration of how technology, tactics, and human skill could intersect to reshape the theatre of war. The P-47 itself emerged from the day as a legend. Its combination of firepower, resilience, and versatility redefined what a fighter could achieve. No longer a machine to be underestimated, it became a symbol of American air power and a constant reminder to opponents that the skies were no longer easily dominated. Pilots who flew it carried both confidence and responsibility, knowing that their aircraft was capable of extraordinary feats, but that victory required skill, discipline, and focus. Reflecting on the day's events, the narrative becomes clear. History remembers not just the machines, but the decisions, actions, and courage of the men who operated them. The Thunderbolt's arrival forced a reckoning, a confrontation between assumption and reality, agility and firepower, experience and innovation. The lessons extend beyond the Pacific War, offering insights into leadership, preparedness, and the dangers of complacency in any high-stakes endeavor. By the time darkness fell, the skies over the Pacific were quiet, but the echoes of that day lingered. The Japanese had learned a hard lesson about underestimation. The Americans had proven the potential of disciplined, well-engineered air power. And the P-47 Thunderbolt, once mocked, had carved its name into history. It was a machine that demanded respect, tested human skill, and reshaped the battlefield forever. In the end, the story of that day is not only about planes and tactics. It is about courage, calculation, and the consequences of underestimating what lies before you. The P-47 Thunderbolt, the pilots who flew it, and the lessons of the skies remain a testament to the harsh realities of war and the extraordinary capabilities of those who rise to meet it. History remembers the fallen, honors the brave, and never forgets the machines and men that defined a pivotal day in the Pacific.